It's my great pleasure to introduce Keith Bodger as the next speaker. Keith is a gastroenterologist at Aintree, but also is well recognized as an expert in health economics and health outcomes research. And it's a great pleasure to ask him to come along and talk to us about his views on the use of routinely collected data, health-related data, how it links in with the registry, and how that offers opportunities for research. Keith, welcome.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm mindful at times marching on, and I think I may skip or curtail some of this in favour of some questions at the end, but I think we've already heard a great deal about data this morning, and I hope that the idea is forming that the registry offers a potential focal point to bring together the data needs of a variety of stakeholders, whether that be for direct care delivery, for audit, for research. But I want to ask a very simple question to begin with, because we've heard much about the information revolution that's coming. Well, it's been a long time coming, and whilst there are these fantastic developments in apps and in portals, they are at the moment in a minority of hospitals, and actually much of the data we would like to get that is very simplistic, the data that's already collected by the NHS, is actually often not accessible in a disease-specific way. We can't, for example, necessarily find out how many IBD patients we have or how many clinic visits they had last year. So you're already answering my question. So do you have a complete database in your hospital? And I guess the answer is predominantly no. And the key thing is the lack of linkage. The fact that even if you've started to assemble a database of IBD patients, very often it doesn't talk to the routinely collected information that all hospitals collect. So the IBD registry is a potential vehicle to allow a data acquisition or recording system, a data warehousing system, some in-house analytics to allow useful metrics to be fed back to the front line, but hopefully service the data needs of a variety of stakeholder groups. But the focus for my talk is research. And if we think about comparative effectiveness research and trying to ask those questions, what is best? Because I think in addition to an information revolution, there is a bit of a revolution going on in terms of what we actually think of as being research. What is research? And actually the hierarchies of research that we've grown up with, in terms of RCTs, for example, as having primacy in terms of informing decision-making, are being challenged somewhat. So this is our traditional view of what research evidence is, and if we look for data in the literature to inform our decision-making, then we may well focus solely on randomized clinical trials. And there are very well-rehearsed reasons why trials are vitally important in establishing aspects of the effectiveness or otherwise of rival interventions. Uncontrolled observational data, the sort of data you might think that might accrue from frontline collection of data in a rather dirty, selective, opportunistic way, uncontrolled observational studies are often somewhat decried. So the randomized trial is often held up as the sort of focal point of information to help guide our decision-making in terms of what is best for the patient, what treatments are best, and when should they be applied and to whom. Now, Sir Michael Rawlins is former chair of NICE, and he had quite a bit to say about randomized controlled trials. And I think these are quite interesting insights from someone who has led an organization responsible for evidence synthesis in the HTA process, that randomized controlled trials, long regarded as the gold standards, perhaps don't deserve that high status pedestal, or at least there is information acquired from other sources that is actually equally important potentially in informing how we use treatments. And if you walk around the posters, you'll see many, many single center observational, uncontrolled studies. So we obviously think as clinicians that this information is quite useful to us in guiding our decision making. This is certainly recognized in pharma, and real-world data, the collection of data in the real world of practicing medicine, is well recognized now as being part and parcel of what pharmaceutical companies need to generate to better understand the place of their products and to justify their use in the marketplace. There are a great deal of differences between RCTs and real-world studies, and of course, RCTs are asking a particular question: can this treatment work? Can it work in relatively optimized situations? Real-world studies aren't asking those questions, but perhaps more, is this effective? Does it work in real practice? And whilst the patient populations in trials are narrow and restricted, of course, in the real world, despite licensing indications, the sorts of patients that are treated with different interventions are much more fluid. RCTs are costly. Think about the entry of new biologics into the marketplace, the rival biologics, the biosimilars. The design and funding of large-scale trials to ask the key questions is going to get increasingly difficult. We know the biosimilars are entering the marketplace for IBD without actually a requirement for RCTs. So there are challenges to performing RCTs to ask some of the questions. And the obvious one is we never get head-to-head, do we? We don't know which of the TNFs was best because, of course, the trials are always placebo-controlled. It's very difficult. So maybe real-world studies offer an opportunity to tease out some of those questions when RCT evidence will not be available. The HTA process for considering Crohn's is an example. So when the HTA and NICE were considering whether biologics would be useful for Crohn's disease and for which patients. Of course, efficacy data was required from RCTs, and thank goodness we had them. But in actual fact, making decisions about whether to approve required observational data on cost, observational data on the natural history of disease without biological therapy, which actually was found wanting, that the availability, particularly of UK-specific data, was quite limited. And this is where perhaps the role and the potential to fill some of those research gaps comes from routinely collected information. This is an interesting study from New York, where the patients attending a tertiary referral service with moderate to severely active inflammatory bowel disease were assessed against trial entry criteria. But they also looked at the patients they were actually treating, so the agents were licensed. And what they discovered was actually a third of the patients they were treating with TNFs would fit the entry criteria for RCTs, but two-thirds wouldn't. So most of the patients being treated wouldn't have got into the trials. And so this sort of post-marketing real-world data is important to understand what is the efficacy of our treatments in patients in the real world. So at all sorts of phases in the launch and post-marketing surveillance of pharmaceuticals or new treatments, real-world data has potential. Well, research-wise, will you get this into high-impact papers, high-impact journals? Observational data will not necessarily hit the research excellence framework. Well, this is, in the last few months, a paper from the New England Journal of Medicine, which is not bad in terms of impact factor, a contemporary clinical practice-based study. So with the appropriate adjustments, registry data can ask comparative effectiveness questions. But of course, there are many, many potential pitfalls in the analysis of such data, but the data needs to be analysed with care. So, the registry. Lots of criticisms in terms of the sorts of data that might arise and its ability or otherwise to answer research questions. Well, it's only going to be collecting data in selected centres. Well, if you look at clinical trials, they're usually fairly selected centres, aren't they? It's a minority of centres. So that's not necessarily a difference. This is a real map. So these yellow blobs are showing where the registry is starting to accrue patients. We're able to geographically map patients. And we hope, of course, to see that spread. But there's no reason at all why useful data cannot arise from selected centres who are further along the journey with the registry than others. Of course, case ascertainment will be challenging, but if you're interested in studies of people who were green jumpers, for example, patients on biologics, then it's perfectly possible to design observational or cohort studies within subgroups of patients within data registries. Equally, there's going to be lots of missing data, and my interest and what I'm going to try to focus on is actually some of the really simple questions and some of the very simple data items may actually allow us some early wins and low-hanging fruit in terms of pushing the research agenda in the UK and IBD, because the data is sitting there, it's just currently not very well analysed. The IBD registry has all sorts of feeds of data, and we've heard about them. My main emphasis here is linkage. We can collect data on patients that are going to be registered, but we may struggle to collect very much. But simply collecting small data items and identifying patients who have a diagnosis of IBD, and preferably when that diagnosis was made, will allow us to link with the routine HES data and other data sets, the cancer registry, portal data. This is actually a map of the data flows, horrendously complex, and the data governance is tricky too, and the issues of consent are not inconsequential. But the registry has largely solved and navigated through that. The data set for the registry is large and complex. We have disease activity scores, we have disease classifications, we have an ability to record cancer events, surgical events. That's very ambitious, and in time, hopefully, at the coalface, this sort of data will be collected. this is all in abstract. Is the registry actually collecting usable data? Well, we've just started to analyse 6,000 patients. This is just a simple demographic profile of the patients who are in the registry data at the moment. And you'll see that there are some trusts with a profile that looks like they deal with both paediatric and adult patients. There are paediatric-only centres. There are some centres that are comparable to each other in terms of the age patients that they've registered. But we're able to start looking at this data. This is over 6,000 patients. We can capture different types of visits and categorise them in terms of the hospital visits. Drugs are in there, we can capture this sort of information. But I think the key early win is to consider the bare minimum of data that you would be required at the front line to enter on your patients that would give you some sort of early win and value back, which would encourage you to aim towards at least registering your patients into the system. Now, we could argue about what the minimum data set is, but I would suggest that simply recording the diagnosis and the date of diagnosis could unlock quite a lot of research potential. Because we have repositories of data, and Omar's alluded to this, in the hospital episode statistics that are difficult to analyse until you know precisely whether a patient has or has not got IBD. And there are all sorts of issues with coding, and outpatient data isn't even coded with a diagnosis. But if we were able to identify and flag patients in IBD within the system, then we are then able to interrogate these data sets intelligently in terms of those patients that have IBD and aggregate the data belonging to our patient population. And we're delighted that Crohn's and Colitis UK have invested in a project. It's the first registry-funded project to try to, if you like, accelerate and inject some pace into developing the shared resource, which is to have a data repository with the linkages set up to allow us to develop outputs that the coalface are interested in. And one of the elements of this project is an iterative development. You will receive emails. You'll be asked, what data do you have at the moment? We will send draft outputs of the data. This is how we can analyze the data. Is this right? Does this look right? How would you tweak it? And iteratively develop with the specialty, bottom up, the sorts of data outputs from the routine data that you'd like to see. And hopefully generate some useful metrics, which then become a research tool and research tool that all potential researchers can use. This is some data that we've looked at in the HES data. So 5 trusts in the registry. This is very simple. How many inpatient episodes do I have for my IBD patient population? Which of them are elective day cases, emergencies, and which are elective admissions, mainly surgery? Can you give me a readout that gives me this sort of information? Then can you break it down? If you can measure all the emergency admissions belonging to my IBD cohort, how many of them had operations? We can then drill down into the day case episodes. How many of these were infusion visits? How many were colonoscopies? And we're starting to develop all these feeds. So you could have an aggregated trust-level report that describes the IBD-specific activity in your hospital. I think the registry offers all sorts of additional opportunities to support research in IBD, not just descriptive observational studies, but also actually randomized controlled trials. And there's a democratizing effect of this, because if you can access the web portal, you now have a system whereby you could, in theory, recruit patients, record their disease activity indices, monitor them over time, submit that data into a central repository, access subsequently the linked data, have 5 years of follow-up for hospitalization events and surgery. So this is a potential resource to actually allow greater participation in research, and also to provide some tools that are generic and shared that researchers can start to factor into the design of future studies. I just wanted to finish with the concept of a data arc. Across the NHS, there's a huge interest in data warehousing and the linkage of health and social care data in a generic sense. But actually, realizing this, I think, needs a bottom-up, disease-specific approach. But the concept of a data arc is to provide this common repository of data and the analytical ability to ask questions of the data. And this is challenging how research might actually interact with the coal face, that essentially if we have real-time feedback every quarter in terms of our outpatient visits for IBD specific, then if we put a portal in, we can monitor over one or multiple hospitals what's happening with hospital activity. So for health services type research and health economics type research, this live feed of simple metrics but that are specific to the IBD patient population locally, I think offers an enormous potential. So to conclude, I think the IBD registry does offer a great potential to support research. I think the idea of having a secure data arc is fantastic, and it exists. The registry exists, the data is there. It's a platform for prospective research and an off-the-shelf solution which may reduce the cost and complexity of designing prospective studies. Of course, there are all sorts of challenges in data content and structure, how the data is captured, how it is linked, but these will evolve. And it evolves iteratively with the IBD community. Then incrementally, I think the power of this data can improve in terms of supporting research, but more importantly, coal-face delivery. What's the key to success in terms of research and all other aspirations of the registry? Well, it is stakeholder engagement and incentives, and that's why we hope the CCUK funded project, providing hospitals with aggregated data outputs from their routine data, using IBD coding initially to identify your local cohort, so you know at least how many IBD patients have been associated with a hospital in the last 10 years. We're going to go back 10 years. But also increasingly with registered patients with clinically more rich data. That this will actually start to give a feel that you're getting something back and there's some incentive to engage with this process. Thank you.